Welcome everybody to our latest book discussion, which is with one of my favorite authors, Bill McKibben. You have probably heard his name. He has written many books over the years, starting with The End of Nature, and we are here today to talk with him and to hear from him about his most recent book, which is called Falter. Bill is currently the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont. He is also the co-founder of a great organization called 350.org. But what is his connection to Texas Tech? My co-host, Bryan Giemza, will explain.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I will explain just a little bit about that. Welcome, thank you for joining us. I'm joining you as usual from sunny Caprock Canyon here in beautiful West Texas. I teach in the Texas Tech Honors College, and today I'm pleased to represent a campus initiative called Creating Livable Futures. It's focused on sustainability and resilience. And it's a special privilege to work with the Sowell Family Collection in Literature, Community, and the Natural World, an archive at Texas Tech that collects the work of writers who are scientists and humanists, and plenty of people who are both. This evening, you'll hear from Bill McKibben, a writer whose papers are a gem in the crown of the Sowell Collection. The Sowell Collection is a unique community of writers, and I'd like to encourage all of you to come to our special collections and get to know the writers and their work, their journals, photographs, and letters. Remember, this archival collection is about literature, community, and the natural world. And if you've had a chance to check out Falter, you know it speaks to each of those elements, but perhaps most of all to community. And in that way, it embodies the spirit of the Sowell Collection and this book series. Our climate book series keeps in mind that climate is one of the original interdisciplinary subjects, and that the group of us who care about climate is diverse and varied, and yet united by concern and curiosity. We want you to be part of the party where we talk about literature and poetry and economics and politics and faith and psychology and family and just being human. In fact, just about everything interesting under the sun is part of the discussion. That's why we need you to be a part of that discussion too. So that's our vision. And again, we're glad you're here, and we're absolutely delighted to have one of the great writers of the Sowell Collection with us tonight. Extremely grateful and privileged to have Bill McKibben with us. Welcome.
Well, what a pleasure to be with all of you and to get to be virtually in Lubbock. It's been an interesting day for me. I started it out speaking to Australia over the web, where they're having the worst floods they've had in at least half a century. Half the country is under some kind of flood warning. But then in the middle of the day, I got to talk with one of my heroes on Zoom, your fellow Texan, Dr. Bob Bullard, kind of the father of the environmental justice movement. And now I get to speak with you all. And in between it all, we're right in the middle of the absolute heart of the sap run for maple syrup here in the Vermont woods. So I've been out emptying the buckets a couple of times in the course of the day, trudging through the last of the snow. And so I felt a little grounded even as I've been going around the world. But it's a special pleasure to end there because of my own connection to Texas Tech. My condolences, Arkansas, and my shout out to Diane Warner for all the good work she's done taking care of those papers of mine in the archive. I'm really, really grateful. And what fun to get to join y'all, especially Katharine, who is one of my real heroes in this work and just an inspiration for the work that all of us are about. So very, very, very good to get to be with you.
Well, thank you, Bill. We are delighted to have you. So just so everybody knows how this goes, Bryan and I have some questions that we're going to be asking Bill. Then we've asked Bill to give us a reading from Falter, and then we will open it up to your questions. So at any point as we go along, anytime at all, you can put your questions in the Q&A, which is at the very bottom of your Zoom window. And if you're on Facebook, listening on Facebook, because we are streaming live there too, you can just put your questions in the comments and they will be conveyed to us on Zoom too. So go ahead and put those questions there anytime you want. But Bryan, take it away with our first question for Bill.
Sure. This first question might help get us up to speed, Bill. Of course, Falter came out in 2019, and then 2020 came the pandemic. And in May, you were on 60 Minutes to talk about how we could flatten both the coronavirus and carbon curves. And then 2020 kind of became the year that just wouldn't stop. So here we are. Here's a chance to add a chapter to Falter. My question is, what are the key points that you might add to the discussion about what you call the human game in 2021?
Well, 2020 was a very dark and powerful year in human history. And so dark that if we don't learn some lessons from it, it will have been a horrible waste and a great sadness, because there was so much human misery. And I think there are two things worth talking about. One is the pandemic. We should have taken several lessons from it. The most obvious, of course, is that physical reality is real. I've spent my whole career trying to convince people that physics and chemistry were unlikely to compromise or negotiate with us. And the pandemic proved the same thing about biology. Doesn't matter what you want to think about it. If the microbe says stand 6 feet apart and wear a mask, then do it, because otherwise you're in trouble. And obviously the same is true about the carbon dioxide molecule. The second thing it should have reminded us is that there are times when physical reality dictates that we move quickly. And we really learned that last year. I mean, I hope that no one ever forgets that the US and South Korea had their first case of COVID on the same day in January. The South Koreans listened to the scientists and went right to work, and everybody wore a mask and they started testing. And fewer people have died in the course of the year in South Korea than die in the course of any given day in this country from COVID, because we paid no attention. Our president decided that it would all go away by Easter, that we needn't worry, that it didn't want to scare the stock market, whatever it was that was floating through his mind. And as a result, we took no action at all. And we know the result, a cratered economy and a huge pile of bodies. For February, when it comes to climate, substitute the last 30 years. We had a clear warning from scientists. We did nothing. And so now we're reaping the results of that. And it means that we have to work all the harder and go all the faster now. And we'll probably talk more about that. But the third thing I think that's really important is that it should have reminded us, and this is kind of one of the themes of Falter in a way, that our sense of the world, I think, has gone askew. Most of us have sort of grown up in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan, which means growing up in the idea that markets were going to solve most problems, that government was the problem, not the solution. Reagan's favorite laugh line was always, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Ha, ha, ha. It turns out the scariest words in things like, well, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is on fire. And there's no, markets are no use in helping you there. What you need is effective human solidarity, the ability to have governments that work ably to deal with problems. And that's why, among other things, it's such a relief to be, these last 6 weeks, to have the feeling that at least people are making the effort and it's going reasonably well to try and deal with that. The other thing, of course, that happened in 2020, and this ties directly into what I was just saying, I mean, the most important thing anybody said in the course of the year was, I fear what George Floyd said as he was being murdered, that I can't breathe. And it was a very good reminder that people can't breathe because there's a racist cop kneeling on their neck, and their whole community is stifled by police brutality. But as lots of people in those communities pointed out, those aren't the only reasons people can't breathe. You can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired electric utility plant down the road. And it's always the same roads as the ones with the racist police forces. It's the same people who get to do it. The asthma rate for Black Americans is 3 times the asthma rate for white Americans. People can't breathe because their governor has told them they have to go inside the house and tape the windows shut because the wildfire smoke has gotten so bad that the particulate levels are off the charts. People can't breathe because it's gotten too damn hot. We actually saw last summer in California the record all-time reliable temperature ever recorded on this planet, 130 degrees Fahrenheit at Death Valley. And really scarier, 2 weeks later, we saw it reach 120 degrees at San Luis Obispo, which is pretty much on the Pacific Ocean. Those temperatures are at the upper range of the human ability to survive for a little while. But those temperatures are going to be standard across large portions of the planet for large parts of the year if we continue on the temperature trajectory we're on now. So again, the only way to deal with that is some effort at real solidarity within this country and around the world to repair the incredible inequalities that drive the crisis that we're seeing.
Bill, it sounds like you've got your next book already outlined, and that's a great title too. So given everything that's happened in the world over, since you wrote Falter, over the COVID pandemic, the massive shift in political priorities over just the last few weeks, what are you most excited about that you're working on right now?
Well, that's an interesting question. I turned 60 in the fall and took it as the opportunity to take emeritus status at 350.org, which I had founded with 7 college students 15 years before. 350 was kind of the first iteration of a global climate campaign, and it's gone very well. I mean, we've organized 20,000 rallies in every country on earth except North Korea, and helped lead in this divestment campaign and fighting pipelines and things. But the best thing is that that so many others followed into this work. And so now there's Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise Movement and Fridays for the Future and the Climate Strikers. And it's just probably the biggest movement ever, which is just wonderful. And so much of it led, as 350 was at the beginning, by young people. As I've stepped back from that, the thing I'm most interested in now, and I'm starting to figure out how to do, and we're sort of figuring out the organizational parts of it, is how to organize the block of older people in this country and then around the world on these issues. Because at the moment, they have, all of us older people always vote, and we have most of the money now. And so it's a kind of political and financial obstacle at the moment to change at the pace we need. But more and more people are coming into this demographic all the time. And I think more and more of them are open to the idea that the legacy they're about to leave behind isn't very good. We're pretty close to being the first people to leave the planet much worse than we found it. And so my guess is, and my hope is, that there's a lot of untapped energy and a lot of skills with people who want to go to work. So that's what we're working on now. Watch this space, more news to come. But it's fun to try. I mean, I'm not really an organizer or an activist by nature. I'm a writer, but it is fun to try and figure out where there might be latent energy in this system that we can liberate and send to work.
I love that. One of my favorite organizations that I've spoken with a few times, but I'm still a little bit too young to join, is Elders Climate Action.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
yes, I love their tagline. Yes, for our grandchildren, for future generations, and for all life. And I just put a link to that in the chat if people are interested. I'm so glad
yes, I've shortened it to no time to waste.
I like that. And then, of course, Mary Robinson, who's the former president of Ireland, she's got a group she calls the Angry Grannies.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of people doing good work around, and I think if we can just bring more of it together, it may turn into a very powerful thing.
I think you're right. Bryan?
Yeah, actually, I'll follow on there, Bill. As you said, you helped get 350.org off the ground to call attention to the threshold of carbon in the atmosphere that we should not have surpassed. In Falter, you point out that we've blown past that line in the sand pretty handily. So I'd just like to hear a little more, and I think people might appreciate hearing a little more about where 350 is headed. You've already kind of raised the subject of climate justice, and I know you've got the Global Just Recovery Gathering coming up. Maybe you could speak a little bit to the work that you're involved in those areas.
Sure. As we come out of COVID, countries around the world are figuring out their recovery plans, their stimulus plans, however, are going to get their economy back on track. And obviously, people are spending lots of money doing this. And so it represents one of maybe the last good opportunity to be putting us on a definitive track towards dealing at the same time with the overarching crisis of our century, the ongoing destruction of the planet's climate. So far, not enough countries are doing what they could or should be doing. And so people are pushing very hard. Over the next week, there'll be this gathering for a global just recovery that 350 is sponsoring, and it's important work. And very good to see that the Biden administration is at least beginning down this path. And we're hearing more and more, even this week, about plans for a $3 or $4 trillion green infrastructure program. Mm-hmm. It'll obviously be under heavy assault, already is, from the fossil fuel industry, who's desperate to keep their business model going a little longer. But I think it's a place we should definitely be going. We're spending a lot of time, though, I'm spending a lot of time not just focused on Washington, important as it is, but focused on the other power center in America, which is Wall Street. 10 years ago or so, Naomi Klein and I launched this fossil fuel divestment movement that's become the biggest anti-corporate campaign, I think, in history. We're at about $15 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. Great educational institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of California system, Brown, Cornell, many, many, many others. And there's, at least at UT Austin, there's a powerful group that's at work trying to get it done, though obviously Texas is a hard place to do this work. That's morphing, that very effective campaign, which has cost the oil industry much of its social license and begun to constrain its ability to raise capital, is morphing into a kind of movement that we've been calling Stop the Money Pipeline, that also goes after big banks, asset managers, and insurance companies that continue to provide the financial resources that keep this rogue industry doing what it does. The last place I went before everything locked down last year was to jail in DC. We got arrested at the lobby of the Chase Bank branch nearest the nation's capital. Because Chase Bank is the biggest single lender to the fossil fuel industry. They've lent them $250 billion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage all of this. They were capable of doing it themselves and apparently happy to do it in an effort to make a little short-term profit. And it's horrible. So we've been after these guys hard. We're beginning to get some results in the course of the year under this kind of pressure. The 6 big American banks have all adopted net zero by 2050 commitments, which is on the one hand good, and on the other hand, who the hell knows what it means. And truthfully, 2050 seems to me a lot less interesting year than 2030, which is really what the IPCC has told us we need to. I mean, if we haven't cut emissions in half by 2030, then our chances of meeting the targets we set in Paris 6 years ago seem to be going by the board. So we'll continue to intensify the pressure. Had it not been for the pandemic, we expected to have people in 2,000 Chase Bank lobbies on Earth Day last year. And as people get vaccinated, we'll be able to return to making some trouble.
Some good trouble. Well, now, Bill, I wanted to ask you something a little more personal, but I feel like something we have in common. For me, for you, for Bryan too, I'd venture to say, our concern over climate change and our response to it is in a large part motivated by our faith. Mm. So how would you explain the relationship between what you believe and what you choose to do and how you choose to respond to the climate crisis?
Well, I should begin by saying that I'm not a preacher or anything. I've never risen higher in the ecclesial hierarchy than Methodist Sunday school teacher. And I live deep in the rural America. So our church is small enough. You don't even have to be, I mean, if you can take a tea towel on Christmas Eve and turn a 4th grader into a Palestinian shepherd, then you're pretty much, that's about the level of theological education that's required of Sunday school teachers. Nonetheless, that strikes me sometimes as kind of an advantage. The Gospels, it seems to me, are not a very complicated document. In fact, one of the things I like about them is that there's a lot of repetition, and it's often occasioned by the fact that the disciples seem like a particularly dim bunch who can never quite remember what it is that they're all about, and they're always asking Jesus over and over again, what's going on here? Why are we doing this? And he has to, well, love your God and love your neighbor, and just over and over and over again, until eventually it begins to get through. I mean, if you look at the world, we are sickening our neighbors, we're drowning them, we're making it impossible for them to grow food. We're sending huge storms their way, on and on and on. If you take any of this stuff even remotely seriously, I don't understand how people of faith can't find themselves engaged in this work. And I've been very, very pleased to see, it's been one of the things I've worked on as a kind of sideline for 30 years is trying to help kind of build a religious environmental movement. There wasn't one 30 years ago, and now there's a very powerful one. And you play obviously a huge role in it in evangelical communities. It's been amazing to watch probably the most important faith leader on the planet, Pope Francis, become a zealous advocate for work, especially for making that link between poor people and environmental degradation. There's so many others. I've gotten to work a lot with the Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, who was an early leader in this regard. The Dalai Lama, on and on down the list. And of course, while the leaders are doing things, the real work's getting done down at the grassroots level. It's all nuns and, interfaith power and light chapters and green faith and, all these groups that have sprung up to do spectacular work. The new Jewish group, Dayenu, so on and so forth. It's wonderful to see it happening. I just don't, as I say, I don't understand how anyone imagines themselves a Christian and not find themselves possessed by this kind of work.
I completely agree. I feel like if people really take the Bible seriously, they would be out at the front of the line demanding climate action instead of dragging their feet at the back. And what a lot of people don't realize inside the US is that outside the US, the situation is quite different.
Absolutely.
So as you just pointed out, Pope Francis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the World Evangelical Alliance, who I serve as climate ambassador, Patriarch Bartholomew from the Orthodox Church, as well as many other faith traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Muslim, all that, they are all active advocates for climate action at the national and the global scale in different countries. So really in the US, this whole idea that somehow being a Christian is incompatible with climate action, it is a uniquely US fable that is based entirely on political ideology and conflating our politics with the Bible rather than what we actually believe. And I feel like it's a very liberating message for people to feel like, to understand, because then you can be who you are instead of who politics and culture is trying to force you to be.
Amen. Amen.
End of sermon. Bryan?
Bill, yeah, so if you don't mind, could you share a little bit, maybe just give us a short reading from Falter before we turn to questions and comments that are coming from our audience?
Sure. I'm going to read right from the end of the book. This book's a long, complicated book with a lot of different parts to it. The beginning's about where we stand now with climate change. The middle is about the kind of sad libertarianism that got us here. There's some stuff about the next wave of things that strike me as things to think about, the rise of artificial intelligence and human genetic engineering. And it mostly ends with a kind of call for movement building and descriptions of the ways that one of the great technologies of the 20th century, the nonviolent social movement, should give us some hope. But the epilogue actually comes from Cape Canaveral in Florida, where I went down to watch one of the launches of, it was actually one of Elon Musk's rockets going up. So let me just read a little bit. The day before the launch, I went on a tour with the public affairs officer who had overseen the rebuilding of dunes along the Atlantic shoreline at the Kennedy Space Center. I'd been warned not even to raise the topic of global warming, which was fine with me. I didn't want to get them fired. This was in the Trump years when these guys were scared. In any event, there was no need because the problem was blindingly obvious. We climbed up a small hill overlooking Launch Complex 39, where the Apollo missions left for the moon and where any future Mars mission would likely begin. The ocean was a few hundred yards away, which is perfect in the sense that launching rockets here on the East Coast means that if something goes wrong, they fall into the sea, but not so perfect given that the sea is now rising. NASA started worrying about this sometime after the turn of the century, and a worry that accelerated dramatically after Hurricane Sandy in 2011. Sandy didn't hit Cape Canaveral, it hit New York City, but even at a distance of a couple of hundred miles, the great storm churned up waves strong enough to break through the very barrier of dunes and very nearly swamp the launch complex. Dunes that had been relatively stable for decades, suddenly they were gone, said University of Florida geologist John Yeager. And so those dunes were rebuilt. They found not only millions of cubic yards of sand, actually on a nearby Air Force base, but also 180,000 native shrubs to hold the sand in place. And so far, the new dune has performed, yielding little ground in the face of recent hurricanes. So perhaps until a few more chunks of the Antarctic crash into the drink or a bigger storm hits head on, our escape route to outer space is safe. But what impressed me more than the new dune was the sheer affection these men had for the landscape where they worked. Kennedy Space Center is the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge, said Harland, one of the guys showing me around. We use less than 10% for our industrial purposes. When you look at the beach, it's like 1870s Florida, the longest undisturbed stretch on the Atlantic coast, Dankert added. This is the other guy. We launch people into space from the middle of a wildlife refuge. That's amazing. They talked for a long time about their favorite local species, the brown pelicans skimming the ocean just off the beach, the Florida scrub jays, the gopher tortoise. When they were rebuilding the dunes, they carefully bucket trapped and relocated every last one of those tortoises. Before I left, they drove me half an hour across the swamp to a pond near the Space Center headquarters building, just because they wanted to show me some alligators. We could see snouts surfacing near the bank. At each corner of the pond, a sign had been carefully placed. The alligators in this area occur here naturally. They were not placed here and they are not pets. Putting any food in the water for any reason will cause them to become accustomed to people and possibly dangerous. And if that happened, they must be removed and destroyed. Something about that sign moved me tremendously. It would have been easy enough to poison the pond, just as it would have been easy enough to bulldoze the gopher tortoise. But NASA didn't because of a long series of affectionate laws that drew on an emerging understanding of who we are. John Muir, in some ways the first self-conscious Western environmentalist, crossed Florida on his 1,000-mile walk from Louisville to the Gulf of Mexico in 1867, a trip he used to form his first heretical thoughts about the meaning of being humans. From his diary, "The world, we are told, was made especially for man, a presumption not supported by all the facts. A numerous class of men are painfully astonished whenever they find anything, living or dead, in all God's universe which they cannot eat or render in some way what they call useful for themselves." His proof that this self-centeredness was wrong was the alligator, numbers of which he could hear roaring in the swamp as he camped nearby, and which clearly caused man mostly trouble. But the alligator was wonderful nonetheless, Muir thought, a remarkable creature perfectly adapted to its landscape. "I have better thoughts of these alligators now that I've seen them at home," he wrote. Indeed, he addressed the creatures directly. "Honorable representatives of the great saurian of an older creation, may you long enjoy your lilies and rushes and be blessed now and then with a mouthful of terror-stricken man by way of dainty." Most of us don't go quite as far as Muir. We still wince when we read of some gator emerging from the water hazard on the 6th hole to chomp an unwary golfer. But his basic idea that all of creation matters has made some real headway. In fact, and here I'll pause for a minute, these two space scientists drew a map for me and told me where to spend the night before the launch of this rocket, the beach a few miles north, where they said if I was lucky, I'd see sea turtles coming ashore to lay eggs. And indeed, I camped out on the beach, and indeed, I spent an hour watching a sea turtle lay eggs, using her powerful legs to excavate a pit. She spent an hour laying eggs, and even from 30 yards away, I could hear her heavy breathing in between the whisper of the waves. And then, having covered her clutch, she tracked back to the ocean in the fashion of others like her for the last 120 million years. I take two ideas from that turtle nest. The first is that we really do live on an unbearably beautiful planet. We don't think of it often as a planet. We live our daily lives on flat and often prosaic ground. And when we're in the air, the flight attendant usually makes us lower the window shade so as not to interfere with the movie. But even with 7 billion of us, the planet remains an astonishing collection, not just of cities and suburbs, but of mountain and ice and forest and ocean. We live on a planet, and it's infinitely more glorious than the others we head for at such risk and expense. The single most inhospitable cubic meter of the Earth's surface, some waste of Saharan sand, some rocky Himalayan outcrop, is 1,000 times more hospitable than the most appealing corner of Mars or Jupiter. If you wanted for some reason to turn that Saharan desert green, you could do it with some water. You can breathe to the top of the highest peak. Everywhere there is life. And this is for me the second lesson. The most curious of all those lives are the human ones, because we can destroy, but also because we can decide not to destroy. The turtle does what she does, and magnificently. She can't not do it, though, any more than the beaver can decide to take a break from building dams or the bee from making honey. But if the bird's special gift is flight, ours is the possibility of restraint. We're the only creature who can decide not to do something we're capable of doing. That's our superpower, even if we exercise it too rarely. And that seems to me the kind of heart of the moment we're in, whether or not we'll be able to restrain ourselves in interesting ways.
That's such a great passage for people who haven't read the book as well. I love the way you started by reminding us about the beauty of this planet that we inhabit. Bill, we're going to get to some audience questions in just a moment. Typically, Katharine and I ask a broad question to segue into that. And I have one that is very much on my mind because I'm working on a book about disinformation, which increasingly I see as a real bar to progress with climate issues. And of course, only this weekend, the Royal Swedish Academy of Science put out a statement saying that fake news is having a very worrying impact in the battle to halt the growing environmental threats to the planet. So I'm curious about, you bring this up a bit in Falter. I'm curious about where your thoughts are with that now.
Well, you've already had Naomi Oreskes on in this series, so you don't really need me to add too much to it. But when people write the history of disinformation, the crucial moment is going to be the moment when the oil industry, at the time the biggest industry in the world, decided that it was going to systematically lie about climate change in 1990. We pretty much got the documents that tell us when and where they decided to do it. And that turned out to be the biggest lie, most damaging lie probably in human history, because it cost us 30 years that we're never going to get back. And we're going to be able to read the damage from it on the geological record of the planet. And it explains part of my, I try not to be angry about things, but this is the one subject that really does make me angry. Because scientists told us what we needed to know in time. We had the warning. It was one of the great chapters in the history of science, the fact that the IPCC was able by the early to mid 1990s to take this immensely difficult problem in physics and chemistry and reach a workable consensus about what was going on. And then to just have that warning overwhelmed by the money and political clout of the fossil fuel industry was horrible to watch, because I was watching it in real time and felt impotent for quite a while until we were able to do things like get this divestment movement underway. We're finally coming out of that. Overt climate denial got on the airplane with Trump to Florida, and I don't think it's coming back. But now we're in this era where, their next strategy is just delay. How much can we slow it down? It's very clear at this point that the Exxons of the world would keep their business model alive if they could another 2 or 3 decades, even at the cost of breaking the planet, which will be the cost if they're able to do it. So that strikes me as the absolute classic case of disinformation. And of course, we've gone on now to, have people who studied that have managed to figure out how to tell lies about an almost endless number of things. And it's gotten easier and easier because we have mechanisms like Facebook that basically seem to be machines for allowing lies to spread more quickly than the truth.
Mm-hmm. They've actually done a study where they looked at false information on Twitter versus accurate information, and they found the false information spread 10 times faster.
Yeah.
So that's actually a fact. What Mark Twain said about how, a lie can circle the world while the truth is still getting its boots on. We actually have science that shows that's true. Well, we have a ton of great questions. People have been asking questions on Facebook. They've been asking questions here. So let's get started with some of them. And the very first question we have is from one of our own former faculty members. I will warn you, he's an expert in energy policy. And he knows a lot about activism. So he's got a good question for you. He says, Bill, you emphasize creating nonviolent campaigns of activism. to raise awareness of the urgency of climate change. So I'm curious to know your thoughts concerning nonviolent acts of civil disobedience, like Tim DeChristopher, who bid on the oil and gas leases and ended up having to spend 2 years in prison for doing that, something that big companies can do irregardless. Do you view these as examples of civil disobedience, or as federal and state elected officials do, as criminal acts?
Well, I mean, there's not necessarily a difference between those two things. I mean, the powers that be make illegal those things they don't want to have happen, and the things they mostly don't want to have happen are people questioning the status quo. Tim DeChristopher is a friend, and I thought what he did was a brilliant piece of political theater. And I thought it was outrageous that the federal government decided he needed to spend 2 years in prison for it. I went to visit him at the federal prison they were holding him in on the California-Nevada border, and I remember it well. And I salute him. And, you know, at the moment, state governments are busy trying to make it impossible for people to do things like protest pipelines. You know, people are in the middle of this big fight against Line 3 in Minnesota right now. And the Minnesota legislature is considering bills that would put people in jail for 10 years for standing up. Those bills have already passed in lots of states, including, I think, Texas. It's, you know, it's standard playbook of powers that be, because they know that civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance are extremely threatening to what they do, much more threatening than violent resistance, which, you know, governments are well equipped to handle. It's the peculiar power of nonviolent resistance, mostly developed by people of faith like Gandhi or Dr. King, that are so troublesome to them.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to stitch together a couple of questions in the thread here. A student, Akash, is asking about so-called new wave capitalism and whether the theory that businesses can maximize profits and solve global issues at the same time is viable. And maybe part two of that, if you'd care to speak to it, Bill, is we have some questions about carbon pricing as a central part of the solution set.
Sure. So, well, let's answer the first one first. I'm not a great systematic thinker. I don't have a kind of fully worked out political economy of the world. And I tend to defer often to people that I really trust and admire. Naomi Klein, I think, is the great thinker about these issues in a lot of ways. And I have profited immensely from her work and her friendship over the years. I will say that I become more and more and more dubious about the ability of our systems to cope with what's going on, just because we get further into them and they give no sign of really catching on. You know, yeah, we can intimidate banks into saying some of the right things now, but there's a new report out tomorrow, the Banking on Climate Change report that comes out every year from the Rainforest Action Network, and they're still lending them hundreds of billions of dollars. It almost seems like I think this much is clear. The laissez-faire capitalism exemplified by the Reagan-Thatcher 80s that we've adopted isn't working. And you can tell it isn't working because the temperature's gone up 2 degrees Fahrenheit and half the sea ice in the Arctic has melted. So those seem like proofs that it's not a good idea, you know, that you need to rein things in. How you do that exactly, I don't precisely know. I'm a good Vermonter. My political seer in many ways is Bernie Sanders. He continually points to Denmark and Norway and Sweden as examples of where we might like to go. And I've been to those places. And I know that they're capitalist. I mean, you give people money and they give you things back. But I also know that there are different kind of capitalism, business heavily regulated, inequalities stamped out, to a large degree, so that there aren't people suffering the way that we allow people to suffer in our country. Oddly, given the fact that they're now quite secular societies, they seem far more Christian in their orientation and outcome than our country, which I'm afraid that if aliens landed, they would find it hard to believe that the United States was a Christian nation, because it's pretty hard to prove it by the outcomes. So that's a long digressive answer. Let's talk about carbon pricing more generally. One of the things I have to restrain myself from doing sometimes, since I did write the first book about this so long ago, is I have to keep myself from saying, oh, if only you'd listened to me then. Because 30 years ago, I think a modest price on carbon I think it would have been enough to steer the, super tanker that is our economy 2 or 3 degrees to starboard. And 30 years later, we would have ended up in a whole different ocean. But thanks to the oil companies, we did exactly the opposite. We went absolutely straight ahead and we kept accelerating. Obviously, we've emitted more carbon since 1990 than in all of human history before it. And as a result, I think we're at a point where if you were going to rely on carbon pricing alone to do what we needed to do, you'd need a carbon price that would be politically untenable. And so it's certainly possible that it will emerge as one of a suite of answers, along with heavy subsidy for renewable energy, along with profound keep it in the ground kind of action of the kind that our new Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, a great moment of poetic justice in American history to have a Native American in charge of 1/5 of the land that was stolen from her people. The kind of work that she's talking about, the carbon price could play a part in that. What we can't do is bargain away those other things in order to get a carbon price, which the fossil fuel industry has made it clear will be their price for allowing it to happen. So there's no rational reason not to do it. There's no rational reason to allow the fossil fuel industry to use the atmosphere as an open sewer for free. No one else gets to do that. Everybody else has to pay to take out their trash. But at this point, it can't be the thing that we rely on alone, I don't think.
Yes, and so in Canada, of course, we have a price on carbon, and they're going to be ratcheting it up to eventually $130 a ton, which is substantial. But there are more actions that are needed because that in and of itself is no longer sufficient, as you pointed out. So we've mentioned the concept of justice, and we have a great question from Valerie Small, who I know is herself a member of a Native American tribe. And the question is, how do you see advancing the Indigenous voice in the climate crisis as part of your work towards justice and equity? You touched on that already with the appointment of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior.
Well, first of all, it really is a great moment. And Deb is a friend, and I've supported and worked with her a lot over the years, and really, really, really am happy about that. It's a hell of a tough job, and I don't envy her having to do it now, I must say. But in general, I think probably the most important thing that's happened in the climate movement, or one of the 2 or 3 over the last 10 years, has been first, its strong identification as a climate justice movement, and the understanding that I've tried to get across for many years, that the iron law of global warming is the less you do to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get smacked by it, which is why it's precisely important that people in frontline communities are in the lead now in this fight. And above all, the fact that Indigenous communities have really emerged at the forefront. People sort of saw that for themselves at Standing Rock 4 or 5 years ago now, but that didn't surprise me in the least, because the reason I started fighting the Keystone Pipeline, which was the kind of mother of all these infrastructure fights, was because First Nations leaders up in Canada, Melina Lubicon Massimo, Clayton Thomas Muller, others, sort of drew my attention to what was going on up there. And I've been working with them and with Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network and others for a very, very long time. These are not only the great leaders here, they're the great leaders around the world. My favorite people to work with probably at 350 are the 350 groups across the South Pacific who call themselves the Pacific Climate Warriors, the people indigenous to those islands, that many of which will probably disappear in the course of this century. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And they sure are. And they're providing extraordinary leadership. One reason that that leadership's so important from indigenous communities is very practical and utilitarian. When, settlers exiled people to the fringes of the continent, they gave them land they thought was worthless, but turns out, what do you know, to be on top of large deposits of hydrocarbon or astride the routes that you need to run pipelines or rail lines to get it to the coasts. And so really savvy and shrewd organizing by Native people have been really helpful in those fights. But I think there's a deeper question here. I'm struck by the fact that I remember being at Standing Rock, and it was basically a place of prayer and ceremony more than anything else. And I think it's really important that the oldest wisdom traditions on our planet are very congruent with the newest wisdom traditions. That is, the view from the sweat lodge and the view from the satellite and the supercomputer seem to me to synchronize quite powerfully. And the message that they agree on is that the conventional wisdom that most of us hold, ideas like endless growth and so on and so forth, are wrong, and that we can't keep doing them. So I think there's enormous power in that synthesis between ancient and modern wisdom traditions. And I hope that it's one of the pivots on which we're able to one of the fulcrums that really allows us to have some leverage in this next few years.
Well, that brings us to, I think, probably the question, which is the one that I get asked the most, and you probably do too. And we've got it here in two different iterations, two sides of the coin. Hal asks, what do you mean when you said the human game is playing itself out? How dark and ominous are things for you? And then Bryan, on the other side of the coin, said, where do you look for inspiration and hope these days, Bill?
Well, I've always stayed out of these debates about whether it's more effective to be optimistic or pessimistic or doomsaying or whatever else, because it's always seemed to me just the basic job of both journalists and scientists to tell people the truth about what's happening. And that's what I've been trying to do for a very long time. Look, at the moment, the truth, I'm afraid, is quite dark. The physical momentum that we've allowed to build up in terms of changes in Earth systems is profound. And, I think actually Texas got a kind of small taste of that this winter with that strange outbreak of winter weather, which looks like it probably is tied to this massive phenomenon of Arctic melt, and hence the rearrangement of the jet stream. The rearrangement of the jet stream and the ongoing rearrangement of the Gulf Stream seem like good markers of just how far into this game we already are and how, what kind of trouble we're in. We're not going to get out of this unscathed in any way. We're already seeing enormous damage at 1 degree Celsius. Man, for me, it was exemplified this past year. We had the worst hurricane season ever, as Texans know, in the Atlantic, more storms. But, the last 2 storms of the year, deep into the Greek alphabet, didn't hit America, so no one paid that much attention to them. They hit Central America, and they did unbelievable damage. We think the damage in Honduras from those 2 storms was the equivalent of about 40% of the GDP. The worst storm to ever hit the US, Katrina, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So when people show up on the southern border in the next few months, coming from Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua, show them some compassion. It's not like anybody in those places did a damn thing to cause climate change. The 4% of us who live in this country have put more carbon into the atmosphere than any other nation on Earth. This is us who did that. And so this is a good place to get to exercise some of that ethic of solidarity that I was describing. So I think even if we're able, and it seems hard to see quite how we're going to be able at this point to hit the 1.5 degree target that we set in Paris, the damage is going to be enormous and difficult to deal with. And lots of species are going to die, and lots of people are going to be their lives degraded. So that's hard, and it's just real. It's where we are. The hopeful thing is that the antibodies to that illness are rising. That's us. That's what movements represent. And the fact that there are millions of people now in the streets is the thing that I've worked hardest to try and get to. When we started 350.org, you know, we mobilized, the first global climate mobilization was what we pulled off in 2009. And we had 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. So that was good, but they were small. There were 100, 200 people at a time. By 2019, led by young people, climate strikes were bringing 500,000 people into the streets of city after city after city. They were the biggest displays of political action we've ever seen. And so that movement building is a source of great hope for me. And it persuades me that at the very least, we're going to have a real fight about this. It's not going to happen, as I feared at a certain point it might, we just sort of walk off the cliff without really noticing it, without really understanding what we were doing. If we're going to go off that cliff now, we're going to do it because we made the conscious decision as human beings that we couldn't bear to rein ourselves in the interest of the future. And at least there's something more dignified about making even a bad decision than just wandering blindly off a cliff. I think that we'll make at least some of the right decisions. And I think we'll do it because I think human beings are capable of enormous love, but we're going to find out. Climate change is, if nothing else, a kind of test of whether the big brain was a good adaptation or not. It clearly can get us in a ton of trouble. We'll find out how much it can get us out of. My intuition is that the brain part may be less important than the size of the heart to which those brains are connected. That's what the test is about, and that's why it, that's why there's so much on the line now. Our future, but also our identity as human beings.
It's so interesting that you would say that because, as you know, my husband is a pastor and a Christian author, and his latest book was just released today. And it specifically is about, yeah, thank you. It is about how it's living from the heart, not the head. That the heart, our true desires, which include our empathy for others, our ability to love and have compassion, that is the way that we are all called to live. And I feel like you've just echoed that perfectly in this context.
Fantastic. And what is it called?
His name is Andrew Farley, and The Perfect You is the name of the book.
Perfect You. Fantastic.
Yes. Bill, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. We have way more questions than we can get to. I apologize to everyone whose questions we couldn't get to because Bill had so much good.
I talked on too long. I rattled on as always, but
not at all. There's many things coming in here in the chat. This is recorded. It is already on Facebook. You can rewatch it on Facebook. We will post this on YouTube, and we just appreciate you joining us and spending your time with us so much, Bill.
God bless, friend. You take care, all of you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yep.
Yep.
Take care.